Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, and welcome back everybody to the 8th Frontiers in Environmental Law Colloquium on environmental law and responsibilities in the Anthropocene, which the New Zealand Centre for Environmental Law is so pleased to co-host with Macquarie University and the Global Network for Human Rights and the Environment. And welcome in particular to session 4, which deals with the subject of symptoms and solutions in a hyperconnected world. And we have some very exciting presentations tonight. What I'll do is introduce each speaker before they speak, or each paper before it is presented. And that way we just have a little pause between each paper, but I will ask you if we could keep our questions for question time at the end, but if they occur to you during the presentations, please do type them into the chat so that they'll be sitting there and we'll be able to cogitate over those and give them a little bit of time and thought. Thank you. So if I may, I'd like to introduce first of all Katie Wollaston, who's going to be speaking on pandemic risk management using a multidisciplinary One Health approach to governance, an Australian case study. Dr. Wollaston is an interdisciplinary researcher, lawyer and lecturer at the QUT Law School. She obtained her PhD in wildlife law and conservation conflicts from Griffith University in 2020, and she holds a master's in law specialising in human rights and social justice from the University of New South Wales. Her research is focused on international and domestic wildlife law and the regulation of the human-wildlife relationship. She's particularly interested in using the social sciences to resolve long-held and deeply rooted attitudes and values that are contrary to conservation and embedding such processes in law and policy. Dr. Wollaston's postdoctoral research is focused on dingo management and stakeholder collaboration on Kafari Fraser Island and the integration of One Health approaches in wildlife trade in the wake of COVID-19. She was an expert on the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, on the panel concerning biodiversity and pandemics. She's an associate editor of the Asia Pacific Journal of Environmental Law and a board member of Australia's National Environmental Law Association. Her first book, titled Ecological Vulnerability, The Law and Governance of Human-Wildlife Relationships, is to be published by Cambridge University Press later this year, and many congratulations, Katie, on that, which is a significant achievement. If you'd like to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I'm just going to share my screen. Bear with me for one moment. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Well, as Caroline mentioned, I'm Dr. Teddy Wollaston. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners across our amazing country that I'm in at the moment, Australia, and note that sovereignty was never ceded. I am on Turrbal and Yagara land currently, and I recognise that this place and all traditional owned places have always been associated with research, teaching, stories and connection. Now, you'll usually find me talking about environmental jurisprudence, but this is one of my more practical projects, and I'm going to talk about some of the links between environmental governance and pandemics broadly, as has been discussed in various places, including the 2020 IPBES report on biodiversity and pandemics that Caroline just mentioned. I'm then going to talk specifically about an Australian application of that report that came about through an Australian Federal Department of Ag, Water and Environment funded project. And that project involved over 30 researchers, practitioners and public servants workshopping the IPBES report in the Australian context and identifying ways that it could be implemented here. The results of that project include a policy brief, which is being provided to the federal government, and a co-authored paper currently being finalised, but I can provide details if anybody wants them. Now, to start, the COVID-19 and other pandemics are rooted in biodiversity. They are caused by microorganisms that are a critical part of biodiversity and are themselves hosted and transmitted by diverse animal species, including people, but not limited to people. So to this end, almost all pandemics of the modern era have been caused by what we call zoonoses. That's a disease that originates in animals and is passed to people. All of these recent pandemics and epidemics listed on this slide have been linked back to zoonoses. Now, although diseases are often passed on by wildlife and other biodiversity, the drivers of that transmission are actually anthropogenic environmental changes. There are large-scale studies that show disease risk is highest in areas of human-altered landscapes because it causes closer contact between people, livestock, wildlife, and other biodiversity. These studies link the increased risk to specific land use changes, climate change, and other high-risk activities such as the wildlife trade. Now, land use change increases the risk of disease spillover, that is the disease actually being passed from animal to human, because of the encroachment on wildlife habitat and the increasing number of people in rural areas. As an example, Hendra virus, which originated here in Australia, has been linked to land use change via degradation of habitat because of deforestation, and land use change via curated pastures and paddocks for horses and other livestock. Agricultural intensification is a big contributor to land use change, as you would all know, and viruses like influenza and Nipah have been passed indirectly from wild animals to livestock to people, with links made directly to specific intensive production methods. Climate change influences wildlife population dynamics and distribution, bringing biodiversity into closer contact with people, and some tick-borne viruses have been linked directly back to the effects of climate change. Finally, the trade in wildlife is a particularly important risk factor for disease emergence because it provides that contact point between wildlife, farm animals, and humans. An increase in the volume of trade due to consumption patterns in high-income countries such as my own, and the efficiency of long-distance transport along the wildlife supply chain drive the movement of pathogens across large distances to contact populations that may not have had prior contact with them before. Many diseases have been linked back to the wildlife trade, including COVID-19, Ebola, and the SARS and MERS viruses. So we know the drivers of pandemics, and also we are able to use the information we have to estimate the risks of future pandemics. Now, these numbers are a little bit scary. What we currently know is that 400 biodiversity-related disease microorganisms have emerged in people in the last 50 years. 70% of those originated in animals. The others were from bacteria, fungi, and the like. What we do not know is how many undiscovered viruses of pandemic potential are currently circulating in wild animal species. This is for a number of reasons, including poor monitoring and lack of funding to allow the science, but also because many of the viruses don't cause any symptoms in their natural hosts, so we aren't alerted to them. However, science is able to make informed estimates based on previous disease emergence, population dynamics, and biodiversity rates. And I'm not going to try to explain that science to you because I don't understand it myself. But the current estimate is that there are as many as 1.7 million undiscovered viruses circulating in the wild right now. And of those, up to half, that is between 631,000 and 827,000, have the potential to spill over to humans and cause local outbreaks, an epidemic, or even another pandemic. We also know that the number of emerging infectious diseases passed from biodiversity to people is increasing because of the increase in contact between people and animals via the drivers that I've just described, land use change, climate change, wildlife trade. So spillover events are increasing. And because of these numbers and the increasing risk of spillover, the IPBES team that wrote the Biodiversity and Pandemics report have deemed this to be the start of the era of pandemics. But we can avoid this. However, to avoid it, it really requires a seismic shift in how we deal with pandemics, moving from a focus on pandemic reaction to a focus on pandemic prevention. Now, The main governance strategy that deals with zoonotic disease and pandemic prevention is known as the One Health approach. The One Health approach to public health governance recognises that human, animal and environmental health are all systematically entwined and need to be considered simultaneously in health decision-making, but not only in just health decision-making, in all forms of policy decision-making across different governmental areas. The basis of the approach is established in 12 principles drafted in 2004 and known as the Manhattan Principles. And if you go through these principles, you can see how the approach could be truly transformative in the way that we consider human, animal and environmental health as integrated. And they really do move beyond responding to a zoonotic spillover event after it has occurred. So for example, the text of Principle 2 states that decisions regarding land and water use have real implications for health. It says that alterations in the resilience of ecosystems and shifts in patterns of disease emergence and spread manifest themselves when we fail to recognise this relationship. Principle 4 recognises that human health programs can greatly contribute to conservation efforts. And Principle 12 notes that the importance of investing in education and raising awareness among the world's people to succeed in improving prospects for a healthier planet. Additionally, the principles seek to reduce the demand for wildlife trade and bushmeat, restrict the mass culling of wild animals to control a disease threat, and seek investment in animal health infrastructure, amongst other things. As an underlying schematic, the One Health approach could certainly transform the way we view research and govern those three pillars of governance: environmental, public health and wildlife health, to reduce zoonotic spillover, but can also increase resilience in all three of those primary pillars. Now, while the One Health approach has had some success in being recognised and implemented and has encouraged institutional collaboration in some ways, particularly among international institutions, there are issues with how the One Health approach has been implemented and interpreted so far. For example, there are definitional issues. There's a lack of agreement on a core definition and what that means, and whether we even need to have a definition or whether it's more of a framework. It's limited in practice, so there has been a number of One Health policies, but how they're implemented on the ground is yet to really be researched, and there's not really a lot of research on what those outcomes look like. There's critique from a jurisprudential point of view that the One Health governance strategy universalises notions of Western health and development, which it most certainly does. There's a lack of engagement in the One Health governance framework with the environmental realm, which is really a very big issue when we're looking at how to prevent pandemics by managing those drivers. Okay, so One Health policies at the moment are really still very largely focused on human health and wildlife health to a lesser degree, and largely ignore environmental health at this point in time. There's also generally a lack of a non-human perspective. Okay, so the One Health policies that we have don't really engage with animal welfare and multi-species justice issues, but remain focused on the end goal of maintaining public health. So, noting those concerns about the One Health system, I'm going to turn to the collaborative research that I mentioned earlier in Australia and the discussion that we had in our Australian One Health workshops. Now, when it comes to the Australian system, we found that the current Australian system related to pandemics and One Health is focused on having the capacity to respond promptly and effectively to public health risk and public health emergencies of international concern. And that's very much in line with the language used in the international health regulations. There is standing health and biosecurity legislation and emergency preparedness and response plans in place, and they're usually governed by state and territory governments. They have primary responsibility for management of disease emergencies and biosecurity responses. However, national coordination at our federal level can be activated if a national response is deemed necessary. Some states and territories do have limited One Health policies, and there is some institutional understanding of zoonosis risks, especially in the veterinary side of things. There are some really great aspects of Australia's One Health system. We have strong international standing and are a trusted broker, and a large part of this is because our federal chief veterinarian has been the leader of the OIE, the World Organization for Animal Health, for the last number of years. We are well connected within the region. For example, we have our federal DFAT, Foreign Affairs and Trade, implementing One Health policies with our Indo-Pacific neighbours. We have a comprehensive suite of response legislation and associated support activities in place. Staff in One Health areas are generally very well educated with good skills and expertise, especially around diagnostics and research. And we have relatively good livestock surveillance, and farmers and rangers are very aware of biosecurity risks. However, there are also some issues, and they're listed on this slide. We have very low investment in prevention. We are, as with most countries, concerned primarily with response. There's low public awareness of the environmental drivers of pandemics. And that's not helped by different theories around this pandemic coming from a lab or different things like that. Our One Health system is not formalised. We don't have a national One Health governance structure. It's very fragmented. There's ad hoc One Health policies in different areas around the country, and it's fragmented because the human, animal and environment aspects of One Health are not given equal consideration, just in the same way they're not in One Health internationally. And we have fragmentation between our local, regional, national governance bodies as well. There's a lack of political support for long-term goals. We have in Australia a very big issue with scaling back of environmental laws at the moment. And I'm sure that others have been talking about that, or will talk about that during this conference. There's gaps in non-native animal knowledge. We don't know much about the risks posed by what are often called feral animals and pets and different things like that, and how they might act as zoonosis spillover events. There's declining support for research generally in Australia, but this is particularly problematic when there's so much we don't know about the pathogens that exist in Australian animals. Biosecurity in Australia is seen as a technical challenge when often it's a social challenge. There's often social conflicts around what biosecurity looks like. Our national wildlife surveillance has been suboptimal, and primarily of concern there's limited knowledge and application of First Nations law and traditional ecological knowledge, which is particularly problematic, although not shocking, not surprising, despite the fact that in Australia, agricultural efforts were a driver for colonisation, but Indigenous people now hold an estimated somewhere between 25 and 54% of Australia's land mass, which is a really vast range due to the uncertainties of native title in our country and the identification of Indigenous people. So what would an Australian One Health policy look like? Well, we have to start by acknowledging the work that our First Nations people already do in this space and let them model appropriate behaviour. Indigenous managed lands in Australia have biodiversity levels that are equal to, if not higher than, Australia's protected areas. Okay, so protected by law, our national parks, etc. Recent studies show that up to 3/4 of Australia's threatened species have ranges that occur or overlap on Indigenous managed lands. And Indigenous land management practices are associated with improved biosecurity, weed and non-native animal control, general conservation, improved fire management, and lower greenhouse gas emissions. So when it comes to One Health and Indigenous first laws include ways of caring for country, share many similarities. Both see the connections between a healthy environment and the health and well-being of people. And the Australian formulation of One Health can and should learn from Indigenous knowledges and caring practices. Now, under that premise, there should be the things that we recommended in our policy brief. There should be an overarching governance body that sits at the federal level, and it should be cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary. It should work like a framework convention kind of works in international law, where there's guiding principles that guide the governance body, but the governance body is there to encourage engagement and participation and ground level policies. There needs to be equality across the human, animal, environment domains. The governance body should promote systems and long-term thinking, and it needs to recognise diversity and justice between different groups, and also environmental and ecological justice, because we know that different communities have highly variable social, economic and environmental contexts in which they're operating in terms of preventing pandemics, but then also how they're affected by them once they emerge. Our final slide. So what would specific prevention policies look like? Noting we want them to address those anthropogenic drivers that I talked about in the first few minutes of my talk. We give examples in our policy brief, and I've listed some of them here, although not all of them. The first is one of the ways that we can capitalise on our existing policies that we have with Indigenous conservation is to expand the current Indigenous conservation projects and get more Indigenous rangers, or train more Indigenous rangers and provide them with the tools they need to be able to manage the lands themselves. We could see One Health incorporated into land use and development planning documents. So we already have environmental impact assessment statements. We could combine that with something like health impact assessment statements that would take into account pandemic risk. We need to transition from high meat diets. That shouldn't be news to anyone, but we did detail a few policy options to help achieve that. We can increase on-farm advice and diversify farms. We need to review our environmental laws in Australia. For those that aren't aware, there was a big review of our federal environmental laws undertaken last year, 2020. I'm losing track of years. And the recommendations made in that review really need to be taken up. We can increase wildlife surveillance, although good news, we're working with the federal government and that's already proceeding, and they've made an announcement just last month about increasing wildlife surveillance. And we need to increase research support, including funding interdisciplinary and collaborative research that seeks to identify and close major knowledge gaps around drivers of pandemics in Australia. And that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Katie. I wonder if you could stop the screen share.
Indeed.
That's wonderful. Thank you for such an interesting presentation. And I'd like to move now to introduce the two authors for the next presentation. The topic is assessing the effectiveness of international environmental law in implementing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And our two co-authors here are Anuja Ishuri and Krishni Apadu. Anuja has completed her Bachelor of Laws with honours at the University of Mauritius, which she did last year, but she hasn't been able to graduate yet due to the prevailing COVID situation in Mauritius. She's greatly interested in environmental law, and her final year undergraduate dissertation has been focused on this field of law. She was supervised by the co-author, Ms. Krishni Apadu. who encouraged her very much to focus her dissertation on international environmental law and the pandemic situation due to the growing research and studies being conducted in this area. And let me tell you a little bit about our co-speaker tonight, so Krishni herself, who is an academic at the University of Mauritius, where she teaches environmental and climate change law and policy, jurisprudence, and international development law and policy. She holds an LLB with French law, a diploma in French legal studies, an LLM in international legal practice, and an MA in diplomacy. She's enrolled on a PhD program with the University of Western Australia and was a Fulbright visiting scholar at the University of California in Berkeley. She's worked at the International Criminal Court, the UN, the Supreme Court of Mauritius, in a multinational company and in NGOs, and is the director of Mind Matters Limited. She was the SIDS Youth Focal Point for the AIMS region for the UN Major Group of Children and Youth. She's been a team member of YOUNGO, which is the official youth constituency of the UN Convention on Climate Change. And she was a sponsored delegate at the UNFCCC's COPs 19, 23 and 24 under the Global South scholarships. She's also published extensively in book chapters and journal articles on the subject of environmental and climate change law and policy. Welcome to you both, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Can you please confirm if you can view my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So, well, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to the organizing committee for this wonderful colloquium, and also a big thank you to my amazing co-author, Ms. Krishni, for her unfailing support. So my presentation will be focused on the following title, which is Assessing the Effectiveness of International Environmental Law in Implementing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, with a focus on small island developing states. So let me first introduce the concept of sustainable development. According to the Brundtland Report 1987, sustainable development is defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Based on the contemporary theories of sustainability, the three pillars of sustainable development, which are environmental protection, economic growth, and social equity, address human challenges in a manner that will continually be beneficial to society, that is, to both the present generation, and it ensures intergenerational equity, and the future generation, ensuring intergenerational equity. So the three main points of this presentation will be as follows. Firstly, how a green economy will meet the aims and objectives of the SDGs. Secondly, the obstacles faced by small island developing states in matching SDGs in response to the COVID-19 crisis. And finally, an evaluation of the role of the UN for international governance and environmental multilateralism. So under the first main point, I will delve into a brief literature review on sustainable development to highlight its significance in our present era. According to scientists, we are currently living in a new geological epoch known as the Anthropocene, and it has become incumbent to promote innovation for systems to operate in society without threatening the dynamic equilibrium that exists between people and nature. According to the UNFCCC, the continued use of non-renewable energy will eventually lead to a potentially irreparable threat to human society. Substituting fossil fuel-based energy sources with renewable ones such as direct solar energy, geothermal energy, bioenergy, amongst others, would hence greatly contribute to the idea of sustainability. In addition, according to the UN SDG 7 policy briefs of 2019, the rapid expansion of renewables can reach approximately 90% of the emission reductions in the energy sector, which is to be achieved by 2050. In short, energy efficiency, the battle against climate change, can only be won through sustainable development. So my next point will be an analysis of how the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic has favored sustainable development. So according to the Adaptation Gap Report of 2020, COVID-19 crisis made it clear that people will support even difficult policies if decision-making is clear, evidence-based, and comprehensive. This needs to be reflected in policymaking. The world leaders have acknowledged the pressing need for enacting the SDGs, and this has been witnessed at the COP26, which was held last year. Changing worldwide patterns of production and consumption has hence become inevitable if we want to guarantee a safe environment for the future. I shall now move on to the second main point, which is the small island developing states in the pre and post COVID-19 strategies. So the Barbados Programme of Action highlighted that small island developing states face special difficulties for socio-economic development due to their unique characteristics, and they have a major dependence on international platforms. In fact, small island developing states are characterized by their small size, and this creates a limitation as to the range of resources, public administration and infrastructure, but also institutional capacities and domestic markets. In addition, small island developing states are isolated from the rest of the world, and this makes them highly dependent on international imports. And they are very much vulnerable to climate change and rise in sea level, and natural and environmental disasters such as cyclones, anticyclones, torrential rainfall, and even droughts. Let us now move on to the pre-pandemic strategies for small island developing states. So due to the time which has been allocated, I will mainly focus on two SDGs, which are SDG 13 and SDG 7. So under SDG 13, which is climate action, climate change is the greatest menace to the survivability of small island developing states. According to a report from the IPCC in 2014, in order to curb the impacts of climate change that mitigation cannot decrease, climate change adaptation is the only effective solution. It is therefore a responsibility for both national small island developing state leaders and international actors to promote constructive adaptation responses and integrate climate change adaptation into domestic planning policies. The Sendai framework in 2015 has provided a shift from the prior management of disasters to now the management of risks through the disaster risk reduction scheme, and has thus provided a good comprehension of the climate-related risk. And this has led to better climate change adaptation policies. So let us move on now to SDG 7, which is access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Well, basically, transition to more sustainable energy systems is theoretically easier in small island developing states due to their small size, but the actual structure of their energy sectors and inadequate capacity hinders the development of such resources. International aid is hence essential to make energy transition a reality. To illustrate this, we may take the example of the IRENA Small Island Developing State Lighthouses Initiative, which has helped small island developing states to comprehensively review renewable energy development to suit the domestic energy sector, and this has led to lower reliance on imported fossil fuels. Statistics have shown that the energy systems transformation has greatly contributed to higher domestic productivity, strengthened climate resilience, and also to the attainment of the SDGs in small island developing states. So these were the pre-pandemic strategies, and we shall now move on to the post-pandemic strategies for small island developing states, and the main idea will revolve around the importance of nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. NDCs are at the heart of the Paris Agreement and stand as an overarching framework for domestic-oriented climate action as it involves climate change-related policies and strategies underpinning synchronized action in respect of predicted impacts and resource allocation. For small island developing states, NDCs are hence commensurate to an indication of what international support they need, whether technological, financial, or for capacity building, and in order to be able to achieve the set goals under the Paris Agreement by 2030. Having said so, let us now move on to the final main point, which is the role of the United Nations for environmental multilateralism. During the landmark Earth Summit in 1992 at Rio de Janeiro, the United Nations has recognized the common but differentiated responsibilities in the context of climate change. Irrespective of their classification, whether they are developed states, developing states, or small island developing states, all states should contribute equally in the fight against climate change, including the duty to take precautionary measures, the duty to cooperate in preparing for climate change adaptation, and the duty to establish integrated plans and policies domestically. Hence, through its numerous specialized programs, namely the UNEP, the UNFCCC, the UNDP, amongst others, together with other international organizations, for instance, the Global Environmental Facility, the Green Climate Fund, the World Bank, just to name a few. The UN has ensured that financial and technical assistance are given to developing states and small island developing states for NDC implementation. For example, the UNEP upholds nations by guaranteeing incorporation of the environmental dimension in sustainable development agendas and has hence supported the UN's endeavors for universal coherence on the SDGs. Now that we have gone through the main points, we may reach to the following conclusion. In our present day and age, the NDCs represent a considerable innovation in global climate policy. A high political attention to maintain focus on NDC implementation and improvement is therefore a necessity, not only for small island developing states, but also for developed states and developing states, irrespective. So as rightly pointed out by former French President François Hollande, I quote, "We have a single mission to protect and hand on the planet to the next generation," end of quote. And this can only be achieved through effective global environmental multilateralism steered by an impartial body in the form of the United Nations. With this being said, I have hereby end my presentation and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Anuja, very much. Can I ask you to end the screen share? Thank you so much. May I just clarify, are we also hearing directly from Krishni?
Miss, will you say a few words?
If you would like to, your option.
No, actually, this is Anuja's presentation. So I'm here if there are any questions afterwards, maybe I can pop around and yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Krishni, and congratulations, Anuja, on your very clear presentation as well.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. In this case, I will move on to introduce the next topic and speakers. And the topic is eco-anxiety and the law, harnessing and triaging for the future. And this work is from Siti Hafsha Idris, and also, although she's not with us this evening, Noor Janana Susha. So first of all, if I could introduce Siti, and I'll tell you a little about Noor as well. So Dr. Siti Hafsha Idris is a senior lecturer in environmental law at the Faculty of Law at the University of Technology, Mara in Malaysia. She joined the Faculty of Law there in 2006, and she's currently the Deputy Dean of Student Affairs. She holds law degrees from that university, also from the University of Malaya, a Master's in Law, and additionally a PhD from the University of Technology. Before she fully engaged in the academic career, she practiced law. She was called to the Malaysian bar as an advocate and a solicitor in 2004. She worked as liaison officer for the international affairs for this university from 2015 until 2019, which involved networking and collaborative activities for partner universities. And she's also appointed as a team member for the collaborative group of global learning, again for her home university. Hafsha's interests are in environmental law with a particular focus on pollution. She's currently working on 2 research projects, respectively, on the biosafety law and socioeconomic considerations, and in the field of liability for transgenic harm. She's written extensively on transgenic pollution, bioethical issues, genetic engineering, and biosafety law. And if I might just tell you a little about her co-author, Dr. Nurjanana Sushan, who is a psychiatrist and trainer. She's been in the mental health field for 12 years and received her medical degree in 2007 and her master's degree in psychiatry in 2016. She's registered with the Malaysian National Specialist Registry. She's a consultant psychiatrist and senior lecturer in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Technology and invited trainer in acceptance and commitment therapy, doing wellbeing seminars for adults and corporate companies. She's currently doing her fellowship in older adults' mental wellbeing with the Ministry of Health National Fellowship Program. And Siti, would you like to tell us about your work with Noor?
Thank you, Caroline, for the nice introductions. Thank you also to my co-author, Dr. Nurjanana Sushan. So I would like to share my presentation now. Where should I share the, I don't see any, okay, share, yes, here. So this is my presentation.
Yes, we can see this.
Okay, you can see this?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So our topic today is actually on eco-anxiety and the law, harnessing and thriving for the future. So actually we came up with this idea after the pandemic and also after there's a lot of episodes, especially since last 2 years ago, we have the COVID-19, and then last year, climate change was also one of the main global issues in the world globally. So we look into the eco-anxiety or climate anxiety and how does the law look into these issues. Because when it comes to the age of Anthropocene, it affects how it affects the mental health of the youth people, of the young people. Because if you go to, like I mentioned here, there's a research with regards to eco-anxiety that demonstrates in clear terms that the failures of the states, of the government to take care of the climate emergency linked to the high level of psychological distress, especially in youth people all over the world. So this paper is actually divided into 2 parts. Okay, the first one is actually looking into what is eco-anxiety, and then the second part is actually on the what are the legal avenues that may be open up to climate litigations as a result of this new research on climate anxiety and how the psychological harm is associated with climate change. So if we see here, okay, what is eco-anxiety? Based on the American Psychology Associations, it describes eco-anxiety as the chronic fear of environmental disaster that come from observing the seemingly irrevocable impact of climate change. And it also associated with the concern of one future that of next generation. So based here, we can say that according to APA, American Psychology Association, it considered that the great environmental problem can affect our planet that can have psychological consequences of varying seriousness in some people. So what is actually eco-anxiety? Okay, so in 2020, and the report was published in 2021. So here, Lancet, it published in Lancet 2021, based on a research in 10 countries, among 10,000 respondents aged 16 to 25 years, the outcome was 60% of them. And then this respondent is actually all over the world, not only from US, not only because the research was based in UK, but the respondents are all over the world, including from Asia, including from Africa, all continents, and also from Australia and New Zealand. So from here, the finding was 60% of these youth, they're very worried and extremely worried about the climate change impact. And 45% of them, they say that the climate affected their everyday life. Three quarters of these respondents mentioned that there's no future or the world is doomed. And the rest of the participants, the respondents, 2/3 of them feel that the government is not doing enough, the state is not doing enough to take actions on climate disasters. So based on these studies, actually, what can climate change do to psychological impacts? So from these infographics from the US Global Research Program, climate change can affect not only the physical, mental, but it also can affect the community health. So as for the physical impact, the climate change can cause air pollution. Okay, but what we want to see here is actually how can this climate change affect mental health? So it can affect mental health through stress, anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So these are actually how climate change can affect the mental health of the community, especially the youth. And on the questions whether eco-anxiety is a medical condition, okay, eco-anxiety is actually a typical reactive experience to fear of environmental doom, as I mentioned earlier. It is not a medical condition as of yet. It's not yet. Okay, but suppose it presents a general anxiety, a persistent negative emotionality, and future-oriented apprehension about climate change, and it can affect one daily functioning, then it can become medical disorder. So this clinical presentation that warrant medical attention from this eco-anxiety is actually these people physically sick, experiencing panic attack, weaknesses, sleepiness, sadness, depression, numbness, helplessness, hopeless, that can prolong period until it affects the daily functioning. So this, even though as of yet, eco-anxiety is not a medical condition, but if the anxiety, whatever psychological impact or emotional impact they have, happen in a long term, and it need a medical attention, then it can be categorized as need medical attention for anxiety or any mental illness treatment. So it is not formally recognized and medically defined. But when mental issue is actually whereby people are depressed and lost control when thinking about the impact of human activity on the planet, then it can actually fall under the category of medical or mental illness. Even though actually two psychiatrists and psychologists has done this research more than 10 years ago, but there is no empirical data on effective treatment yet. And recently, I think within this week, there's a news that from New York Times that eco-anxiety should enter the therapy room. And then all the actually what they are doing now is they have the eco-therapy, but it is not catered for eco-anxiety. So perhaps in the long run, there will be an eco-anxiety treatment for these people who are having eco-anxiety. So on the second part, we are now looking into the second part, what is the legal implication of eco-anxiety? So for eco-anxiety, we can see here that what are the implications that as the plaintiff, as the one who are suffering for eco-anxiety, what they can claim. They can claim damages, of course. They can claim damages. They can claim damages from the company or from the state that are actually contributing to the environmental or the impact that happening surrounding them. For example, recently Malaysia is having heavy flood. So we did some survey on what is actually affect their daily life. So some of them, they're really scared of whether this flood will come again. And this really affects not only mentally, but emotionally to them, because they are so worried. Every time there's a rain, they will be so afraid. So they can claim damages, okay, for this under environmental law. Okay, they can claim damages under the criminal suit, whereby under our law is under Environmental Quality Act. But of course, it is quite difficult to prove whether they are really affected by the disaster, and then how actually the evidence linked to the disaster happens, and then the evidence that they are not supporting, the government is not supporting. Because if we look the previous research just now, as I mentioned earlier, some of the youth actually, they don't have a confidence with the effort that the government do to really protect the environment from these environmental disasters. So yes, they can claim damages, but to prove under this, not only the criminals litigation and also civil claim is hard to actually to prove in these situations. On the other hand is maybe we can go to, because what we need is actually the legal avenue, what we need is actually the binding law that mandates the cut in climate damaging emissions. And then we also need to ensure that whether the law and policy are really exposing them to potentially irreparable harm within a just few decades. Because especially the youth, okay, for in our country, we are this term is so new for us, but it's actually is happening in our neighboring country, from Indonesia, from Philippines, because they have so many natural disaster. But Malaysia, we are actually very infant in this, but even though this is new, but some of the preliminary data that we collected, that some are afraid that the law that we have now, the development, the Environmental Quality Act that we have now, actually allow the pollution to license to pollute the environment. And then we have the EIA, and then we're afraid that this can expose to more harm within just a few decades. For example, what as Prof. Caroline mentioned just now, I did some research on transgenic pollution, on the transboundary pollution, and also what happened if this is it's good to secure food for food, but at the same time it can also impact the environment and impact the public health. So how this law and policy is really protecting not only the environment but also to protect the public health. On the second part is on the rights, human rights. One is right to healthy environment, as been recognized by the UN Human Rights Council, right of environment to healthy environments. But in Malaysia itself, we do not have very clear definitions what is right to healthy environments. Is it fall under rights to live under the federal constitution? Even though there's a case, but there is no certainty whether this is actually really protected. Right to healthy environment is really protected under the federal constitution. And then as we refer to the case of Agustin Ho and also Portugal's recent judgments, it can also fall under right not to be subjected to ill treatment. Okay, for example, the state does not take necessary steps to prevent any climate disasters. So whether this plaintiff or the victims can go to the court and say for the violations of rights for ill treatment. So this is a question that we still need to embark into a further research on this and to compare with other countries, particularly on what is the best mitigations for climate change, so that to protect the rights of the person who are having eco-anxiety, and then whether they have the protection or not. And of course, with eco-anxiety, one is we discuss on the legal part, what is the legal avenue for them. Now we go to what can the victim do to cope with eco-anxiety. So they have to identify and acknowledge the anxiety, and then they cannot run away from that. Okay, this is as what being doing by this the therapist for the person who are having with mental illness. So they have to take charge. For example, they need to volunteer with the community to save the environment, and then they seek knowledge on nature and environment, find more information on what they can do as a family and community. And then they have to charge, not they, but also we have to change our habit to eco-friendly habit as individual, family, and community. And then we have to be optimistic and have hopes in all the small steps we are taking to protect the environment. And then lastly is actually we need to talk and get involved more on this environmental disaster, climate change, so that we can demand action from the states whenever it is necessary to protect, not only to protect the environment, but also our public health, and also to avoid any unnecessary stress and also psychology impacts to us, so that the government know that what we really need, then they can hear our voice. And of course, we really need interventions and also administrative and legal frameworks to address eco-anxiety and also climate change to benefit those most vulnerable and least responsible for causing the global climate emergency. With that, thank you from both of us.
Thank you very much, Cece. Thank you. And that brings us to our last speaker on the topic, responding to the Anthropocene, can international law address global concerns? And our speaker now is Karen Morrow, who was educated at the Queen's University of Belfast and King's College, London. She's lectured at Buckingham, Durham and Leeds universities and at Queen's University of Belfast. She's been Professor of Environmental Law at Swansea University since 2007. Her research interests focus on theoretical and practical aspects of public participation in environmental and sustainability law and policy, and on gender and the environment. Her current work focuses on ecofeminist approaches to the challenges of the Anthropocene, with particular emphasis on climate change. She's a series editor for Critical Reflections on Human Rights and the Environment with Edward Elgar, and a member of the International Advisory Board for the Cross-Disciplinary Gender and Environment series with Routledge. She serves on the environmental boards of the Journal of Human Rights and the Environment, the Environmental Law Review, and the University of Western Australia Law Review. Karen, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Caroline, and thanks everybody. These have been great papers, and I can say that from the bottom of my heart because you've seen me through sunrise this morning as I give you greetings from old South Wales. Just let me share my screen with you, and we'll get going on this last session. Right. Okay,
You can see this. Right.
great. So, can international law actually really address global concerns? That might strike you as a really obvious question. It would have done me, I think, before I began my academic career. That's what it's for. But I've had a lot of time to think, as most of us have over the pandemic. And I have some reflections on what I've learned from more years than I care to think of as an international environmental lawyer working in the context of climate change, and what I've seen from the pandemic. There are certain areas there that I think have helped me look again at international law and its ability to actually change the world in positive ways. And I think it's a good time for reflection on this. I think there are commonalities in environmental law and global responses to COVID. There are some differences too, but I think they're really useful to look at a little more closely. So let's do that. So in South Wales, even our vandals appear to suffer from eco-anxiety, I think. It wasn't me, but I did find this in my local town, and it seemed quite illustrative of what I wanted to talk about today. So the Anthropocene is very obviously a moment of crisis, and whether or not the geological community ever actually decide to formally designate it as a geological epoch, for the social sciences and for just about everybody else, we already recognize the power of the Anthropocene narrative to capture this moment in our species development and our relationship with the planet. And that begs some really important questions. So, is the international legal system equal to the challenges we face? Is it now? Can it be? Can we avoid replicating the systemic flaws of the past? And I'll talk more about those, certainly from an ecofeminist perspective, but that's not the only means of exposing flaws in international law. And can we learn anything from the COVID crisis that might better equip us to deal with the future crises of the Anthropocene? Because the Anthropocene will bring more global challenges to us. There are some interesting points of comparison, I suppose, between COVID and other Anthropocene phenomena that I think it might be valuable for us to explore. So we could use COVID as a harbinger or a forerunner of the full extent of the Anthropocene that we've yet to see in other areas, but certainly in climate change, we're rapidly seeing develop. So I was very relieved to hear Katie taking the view that I take, that all the evidence points to COVID being a zoonotic disease. But even if you do believe the lab escape conspiracy theories, from an anthropocenic perspective, that makes no difference, because it would still involve COVID being natural in origin, but brought about in synthesis with human behavior. If it were a lab escape, it would be even more direct rather than anything else, rather than the behavioral type patterns that Katie's already covered so brilliantly. So, spread. COVID has spread by interacting natural transmission and human systems. And actually, that's typical of Anthropocene threats, not spread for other than diseases, but certainly incidents. What we're seeing with things like climate change is the interaction of Earth systems and social human systems that result in global impacts, and they can be very swift. Certainly having looked at the Stockholm Resilience Centre's work on planetary boundaries, we can see quite swift, in geological terms, changes in the planet and at a planetary scale already. And we also have the threat of much more swift change to come, with tipping points potentially being reached. So there are parallels there. And that spread for COVID, or those incidences for things like climate change, are global in reach, but of course not equally felt. They respond to not just geography, but also to human systems, particularly economics, health and social care, and social support, in terms of how well we actually engage with them. They interact with human governance and government systems in terms of how effective our decision making is, and how good we are actually to pick up on some of the factors that CT was raising about psychology, how good our governments are at bringing the people with them on action. So there are things that we've seen here from COVID that I think are quite revealing. Then there are responses. Now, with COVID, we've been lucky, and that sounds ridiculous in the context of a pandemic that has killed literally millions worldwide. But we have had tools at our hands to mitigate here and to adapt, albeit that has proved immensely contentious. And here we've had science that has been very swiftly, because of years of preparation, viably mobilized to actually engage with the threat. But even that has been contentious. For other Anthropocene threats, we're in nowhere near as good a position. For climate change, just as one example, mitigation remains hugely problematic. COP26 reveals that we're not on track to meet the international targets that we put in place, the 1.5 degrees threshold. At the rate we're going, will be breached. Adaptation, well, we can adapt to some of the threats of climate change, but not all. It's not always possible. And can science save us? Science can ameliorate some of the impacts of climate change, but probably not all of them, not necessarily swiftly. And sometimes the solutions may be even more problematic than the initial issues. I read a fascinating article in Nature just yesterday about solar engineering, and the idea that if we have unilateral state action on that, there could be massive impacts on other states who haven't signed up to a solar engineering response, and the problems are huge and many. So in terms of the drivers and what these things look like, COVID's actually in some ways a best case scenario, and I can't imagine many situations where anybody's saying that. But how have we dealt with it? Well, the answer is not very well on some levels. We've had the equipment in our hands to deal with it in fairly short order, but we've not necessarily used it very well. And one of the biggest things that I've seen in looking at this so far is that what COVID has really done has exposed the weaknesses and the flaws of international institutions. And I'm going to look here particularly at the WHO and its role, and COVAX. And what we see here is individual states really almost sidestepping the international community, or certainly not regarding it as the central driver to their efforts, and a system that's failed to deliver global solutions. And this despite very explicit "we're all in this together" rhetoric by the United Nations. For example, in General Assembly Resolution 74-270 in 2020, and on global solidarity to fight the coronavirus, and 74274 on international cooperation to ensure global access to medicines, vaccines, and medical equipment to face COVID. What we can see here is the right things are being said, but they're not being delivered on. And I have to say, as an environmental lawyer, that's horribly, horribly familiar. Right, let me move on. So if I look at this as an ecofeminist, and that's my preferred frame of analysis, there are many others you could use, I see the COVID problem along the same lines as Katie does, I think, from a different perspective, but rooted in human exploitation and manipulation of the natural world. And that biting back once it is augmented by our societal structures. And what we see there is that a global pandemic or any anthropocenic threat will augment the existing social inequalities that we have in our societies. So for COVID for example, the disease impacts themselves were gendered, although not treated as such, but certainly for death, actually men were more likely to die than women. But for long COVID, women are more likely to get that than men, according to the statistical information I've seen from studies in the Lancet. But they were also aggravated by ability or disability, class, economics, the ability to self-isolate, etc. And in the UK, certainly, they've been shown to be racially differentiated as well. And these factors all mix together in a form that intersectional feminism has long recognized, but you'd almost think that was something that didn't exist in looking at how we deal with COVID. And these gendered impacts have actually been very, very direct. Professional carers, for example, although not dominant in as doctors, women, of course, in most societies are the vast majority of nursing professionals and provide the vast majority of social care, both paid and unpaid. So there were gendered inequalities in COVID in terms of what COVID itself was doing. There were also gendered inequalities in responses to it, particularly indirect impacts on unpaid carers, usually women, but also a lot of the sectors that were most affected by COVID shutdowns, etc., were things like service industries, where women are much more likely to be employed and provide the majority of the workforce. So unequal impacts of shutdowns and of attempts to mitigate. Impacts of lockdown as well interacted with other structural inequalities. So in that, COVID actually is no different from what I know already about climate change being something that impacts unevenly on people. And that's true not just of these Anthropocene phenomena, but also of policy and law responses to them. So looking at the global response to COVID and the WHO, what I have seen from looking at it so far is that COVID connects to and augments existing concerns with the system. So for those of you who are not so familiar with it, WHO was a specialized UN agency which was founded in 1948, and it works with a very diverse range of stakeholders, not least the 193 UN member states. Even before COVID, though, the WHO was acknowledged as being underfunded and underpowered. It's enthralled to state sovereignty, and like most international organizations, the WHO will encourage, exhort, beg states to behave in particular ways, but of course it can't compel them to do so, even when they've signed up to particular courses of action or given their support to UN resolutions in that regard. Probably those are things we're all familiar with if we've ever worked in international law with weak institutions that are underfunded. COVID, though, has made me look at the WHO a bit more closely, and I was quite horrified to discover that around 80% of the WHO's funding is tied to donor preferences. So they only have control over about 20% of their budget to do specific things that are not stipulated by donors. And the stakeholder approach that the WHO adopts is great on the one hand and very, very voguish, very fashionable in international law on the other, but it is also something that places them at the mercy of a lot of different actors. So NGOs, states, and philanthropic organizations. And the COVAX initiative, I think, gives a very good snapshot of what that actually means in practice. So COVAX was the scheme to roll out vaccinations worldwide, led by the WHO, but also with Gavi, which is a partnership on vaccines between the WHO, UNICEF, the World Bank, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, which is also a global public-private partnership, and UNICEF. So COVAX itself is a public-private partnership, and that has benefits in terms of swiftness. The international system is very slow in doing anything in traditional channels, but it also raises concerns in terms of who's setting the agenda and what shape that's having on the agenda. And COVAX has been criticized for a very selective view of the global collective interests. It's very much Western and developed world focused in its membership, and it's been reluctant to engage with NGOs and then quite limited when it eventually did so. It aimed to provide free or subsidized vaccines to cover 20% of the populations of 92 low and middle income countries. Other participants, 51 high and middle income countries, would pay for their vaccines as part of the scheme, but they would use it as a safety net. And crucially, those countries tended to adopt an approach where they went out and set up lots of deals, bought their vaccines, and didn't use COVAX in the end. It's been immensely problematic in terms of delivering. It's not met any of its targets. It's been flawed by timing, by communication, by failure to recognize the realities of delivering at domestic level in poorer countries with stretched medical systems, and it's really been very ineffective. So there are longer term issues here for taking a better approach. Has a case been made for a global health law? Well, there's been talk of a global health treaty in the pipeline since about 2017. You might think that COVID would have pushed that right to the fore, but really it hasn't. The WHO has actually shifted its perspective from being broadly in favor of a treaty, a binding agreement on global health, to a less formal soft law pact on pandemic response, which is it's now looking forward to develop. There are lots of questions about whether there's much difference between hard and soft law. In practical terms, it really depends on what it says and what those who sign up to it agree to do and what they do actually do, rather than the form it takes. But in symbolic terms, there's a lot to be said for a treaty, a hard law. It sends a message about a united international response. Soft law tends to allow more space for fragmentation. And there are real tensions here. The US in particular is standing out against anything binding. The EU is pro something binding, and it's all going to be a bit of a mess. I'm going to be watching it quite closely. So what have I concluded about where we are now in this very quick whistle stop? Well, when we're looking at Anthropocene impacts, we need to look at causes carefully, but realistically. We need to actually be very cognizant of the links between hard science and soft science, or the social sciences. and actually acknowledge they both have a huge part to play, and it can't be all about the hard science, because that's never going to be enough to change behaviours, or indeed to change the way states do things by itself.
Karen, it's Caroline here.
Yeah.
Just one more minute.
Yeah, this is the last slide, so I'm just going to, you can read most of what's on here. We need to be more careful about human environment interactions. We need to recognise that science is limited in terms of how quickly it can progress and what it can do, and its efficacy is limited in terms of social acceptance and what we do. And we need to look at very carefully when we do look at our science-based policy to make sure that we don't take the supposed blindness of science, the neutrality of science, which isn't actually neutral, through in a way that actually exacerbates existing systemic social inequalities. That's domestically, but also globally. Do we need global approaches like a framework convention on global health? I honestly think we desperately do, but we also need to think a lot more carefully about how enforceable those might be. And international law and international institutions, if they don't really take a collective approach, are not going to solve any of these problems. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Karen, and another fascinating paper covering a wide range of issues. Well, we've reached question time. In a moment, I'll turn to the questions in the chat. I did briefly just want to pick up on the issues arising out of CT's paper, because at a conference on responsibility and in response to a paper that does raise these matters of direct concern in our teaching, I thought it might be just important to touch on the importance of seeking to teach international environmental law and climate change in a way that, if at all possible, will help empower those who we are teaching to seek solutions, to take a proactive outlook and so forth, rather than, of course, labouring the facts, which, as CT so rightly points out, can be quite undermining of mental health. So thank you, CT, very much for your presentation. I should turn to the questions that we have in the chat, and they are from Sri Watini from the Faculty of Law at the Universitas Islam in Indonesia. And the first question is to Katie. Concerning the future of Australian One Health policy, one of them is to recognise diversity different communities which have variable social, economic and environmental context. Would you like to elaborate and provide an example to implement the policy when the government has already identified those kinds of differences? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I would not necessarily agree that the government has already identified those kinds of differences. I think that a lot of the time they need some help in that area, but we'll see how that goes. I just wanted to point out that Karen really addressed very well the different contexts around how COVID has impacted different groups, different social groups. And so I'll defer to that discussion, but when it comes to policies in prevention, usually when we're looking at policies in prevention and environmental policies, they have the same exacerbating effects that Karen discussed. So we're looking at the impacts that policies might have on marginal groups, on groups that are already struggling in Australia, such as farmers, and the impact on Indigenous communities that already feel so much pressure around work that they're being asked to do. And so the policy response to that is to have place-based policies and systems. And what that means is that you need to have a policy kind of briefcase. It has lots of different policies that the communities themselves can choose in terms of what's going to work for them. And there's a number of different policies that they can choose from and work towards that are going to be less disruptive for those communities.
Thanks, Katie. Can I just add a little follow-up question? You talked about prevention there, and so many of the problems dealt with in this conference are tinged with the need for prevention, whether it's climate change or COVID. or future pandemics indeed. And the question I had was, do we need a new approach generally to compliance in international environmental law, health law, global law, the global problems that Karen spoke of? Should we make more of facilitative compliance mechanisms in particular in such an interdependent world where we have so many problems to try and prevent?
Absolutely. Karen mentioned the Global Health Treaty. Pandemic treaty is still on the cards. It's something that's currently being discussed. As Karen mentioned, it's not all about global health, it's about pandemics. And one of the problems that I have with it and that I've written about is that it's still focused primarily on public health and not the drivers of these problems that we're having, but it ignores all of the other international agreements we already have that address various aspects, including public health, trade, environment, climate change, when this treaty is just going to have the same effect as those treaties if we don't address compliance, monitoring and enforcement. And that's really the crux of what's going on in the international arena. We have the principles and the rules there, perhaps not so much in the vaccine space. We need some more rules around vaccine sharing and equitable distribution, but the international system is already set up to provide solutions to those problems. It's just the monitoring and enforcement, as you say.
Yeah, thank you so much. I do think, in fairness, I should ask the question to Anuja as well, and then I'll throw the floor open to the panelists for any final comments. So Anuja, you have a question also from Srivatini regarding the adaptation to climate change in small island developing states, especially to have access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern technology for all. Since the condition in small island developing states, a lack of financial support, lack of technology, and even for human resources, how does it work, the adaptation that should be conducted in these states?
Well, first of all, thank you for your question. So basically, small island developing states rely a lot on funding for adaptation from donor countries like France, the EU, and in the case of Mauritius, we have been assisted in various projects by funding from India. And there is also currently the Indian Ocean Commission, which is heavily involved in adaptation projects, especially in Indian Ocean small island developing states like Mauritius, Maldives, Seychelles, and the Comoro Island. And there is also knowledge and technological sharing within small island developing states in the Pacific Caribbean regions in terms of adaptation strategies. So in a nutshell, we rely heavily on other developed or developing states in order to assist us and facilitate livelihoods of our local people.
Thank you so much, Anuja. And I will come to Karen and then finally to Siti for any final words, given that we have just a couple of moments left. So Karen, we would love to hear your further thoughts.
Just very briefly on technology transfer, one of the big problems with the vaccines thing that we've seen is that as with climate change, etc., and technology, there states are making promises in international law, but of course they're not the ones who can deliver. And IP law is actually a huge obstruction to technology transfer. So the changes that would need to happen for technology transfer to really work actually go beyond what states promise to looking at the legal aspects of the legal system that stop them from delivering on that. There are huge vested interests involved too.
Yeah, thanks very much. And finally, Siti, was there any final comment that you would like to make before we close the panel? Okay, I can see your microphone is not on, but we can tell that
sorry. Yeah.
Well, look, we've been so pleased to hear such a diverse range of presentations on all of these issues. It remains to be seen how all of this hard law and soft law is going to land together. We have so much more of all of this law than we ever used to have, and certainly plenty of the soft law as well as the hard law. So perhaps we can go away, and in the morning when we wake up and we've reflected on the One Health principles and the SDGs, and perhaps I can slip in the NDCs, and perhaps also the right to health and so forth, that it may fall into some kind of order in our minds going forward. So we'll see how we wake up tomorrow. We're looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow at further sessions of the panel, and thank you so much for your valuable contributions this evening, and to our audience and for the questions in the chat as well. Good night, everybody.